guys, welcome to my channel. This is Jay from Coding with Jaybird, where I upload weekly tutorials to help build your confidence in coding. This is part 15 of my beginner series, JavaScript tutorial for beginners, and we're going to be having a look at loops today. Let's get started. I've opened my loops project folder here in Visual Studio Code, and you can see a loops.html file, which is linked to the styles.css and the main.js in the JS folder. Now my HTML file is pretty simple. I just have an h1 tag within a main that says loops, and I have a section with an ordered list of my three main loop types: the for loop, the while loop, and the do while loop. Let's start coding in our main.js now. So let's have a look at loops. What are loops? Well, loops check to see if a condition is true, and if it is, it runs a certain block of code. It then checks the condition again, and once again, if it's true, it reruns that block of code. And this goes on and on until that condition is no longer true. So once that condition returns a false, we exit the loop. There are three common loops in JavaScript: the for loop being the most common loop, the while loop, and the do while loop. Let's start practicing our for loop first. For loops are great to use when you know how many times the code block should run. A counter is commonly used as its condition. So a for loop would look like this. We start by writing the keyword for, our brackets inside where we're going to have our conditions, and then the curly brace where we're going to have our block of code. So in the round brackets, I'm going to be placing my conditions. So we start by setting a value for the counter. So I'm going to let some counter, so let I equals 0. So we're starting at the value of 0, and the condition comes next. Here I'd like to say I should be less than 3. So what I'm saying is we're going to run this loop as long as I is less than 3. Now we need to find a way to also increase or decrease I. So here we're going to have I plus plus, which basically means I is equal to I plus 1, or we increment I. So what we're going to do in here is we'll have a console.log message, and we'll just display for loop number, and I'm just going to concatenate that with the value of I. So the way this works is the for loop will start with a counter value of I that's set to 0. It then checks to see, okay, is 0 or I less than 3, which it is, and if so, then run this block of code. Once this block of code is completed, I increments by 1, and then we check this condition once again. So now I equals 1, and we check to see if that I, which has a value of 1, is less than 3, which it is, so we run this loop once again. And this goes on and on until I equals 3. It no longer meets this condition. This condition returns a false, and we exit the for loop. So if I save this, we can see here the loop has run 3 times. When I was set to 0, then I was set to 1, and then I was set to 2. Now, for loops are great for iterating through arrays. So let's practice that. Let's create an array called stationery. And in stationery, I'm just going to pass some simple items that we'd have on our desk. So let's say pens, pencils, erasers, let's say, rulers. Okay, so we have a stationery array. And now I want to iterate through this array. So I would create a for loop. I would say for, and now my conditions are going to go in here. And what I want to do is, here instead of I, I'll use something else, because that variable could be anything. So I'll say let A equals 0. And I'll say A is less than. And now what I want to check for is I want to check the condition where A has a value less than the length of this array. So if we simply write stationery dot length, and that will give us the length of this array, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're checking to see as long as A is less than 4, we want to run this for loop. And after, we also want to increment the value of A so it actually goes up. And all I want to do is log a message to the console that's going to display each and every single item, and I'm going to extract each item in the array by using A, because A starts at 0 and the 0 index will be the first item. So when I save this, let's see, what do we get? We can see pens, pencils, erasers, and rulers. So what we've effectively done is we've iterated through this array step by step from the index value of 0 all the way to 3. Once a equaled 4, a was no longer less than the stationary dot length, which is the value 4, and we exited the for loop. Okay, great. Pretty easy so far, right? Now let's practice the while loop next. Now the while loop is great to use when you don't know how many times the code block should run. So instead of a counter, the condition is usually something else. The code block runs as long as the condition is true. So in this case, we need to set the counter value first. So we'll say let I equals 1. And now for the while loop, we start by writing while, and then the conditions are going to go in here, and there will be our code block that we want to execute. So for the condition, I want to say run this loop while I is less than 7. So we're starting at I is equal to 1, which will definitely meet this condition, and then we'll run this code block. And again, I'll just log a message to the console, while loops run, and I'm going to concatenate this with the value of I, and we'll join this with times. So we should see while loops run 1 time, 2 times, and so on. Now, how do we increase the value of I, and where do we do that? As you can see here, it's a little different than the for loop. We don't have the increment occurring inside the condition or inside the brackets. So what we have to do is we need to remember that we need to increment I at the end of our code block. And if we forget to increment this, we're going to have an error because the loop's going to run infinitely in the browser. Now when I save this, you can see while loops run 1 times, run 2 times. Okay, that doesn't look good. Let's change loops to just loop and save it again. So the while loop runs 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and so on till 6 times. And you can see we start with the value of I is equal to 1. When I is equal to 1, 1 is less than 7, we run this code block. So the loop runs 1 time, and we do this until I equals 7. Once I equals 7, 7 is no longer less than 7, so we exit this code block. All right, our last loop is the do while loop. Now this loop is almost identical to the while loop. However, its main difference is that it always runs once, irrespective of what the condition may be. So this is written a little differently. Let's start by setting a counter, and this time I'll call it a counter of j. So j is equal to 1. So this is just me setting the counter to 1. So the do while loop is a little different. We start by writing the keyword do followed by curly braces. So we don't actually have the condition right after the word do. However, after the curly braces, we now put in our condition. So we do some block of code, which is going to go here, while this condition is true. So let's say for our condition, we'll use the counter j and say j must be less than 10. So do something, the something will go in here while j is less than 10. I just want to log something to the console in this code block. So let's write console.log, and we'll practice multiplication here. Using concatenation, let's display this. Okay, and we can't forget that we also need to increment I, otherwise we're going to keep running this loop over and over again. So let's say I plus plus here. Now, when I save this, we're going to see we've run through this loop 9 times. So we start with the value of j equals 1, 1 times 2 equals 2, and so on until j equals 10, it no longer meets this condition, and we don't run this do loop again. However, the do while loop can be a bit tricky. So let's have one more example here. Let x equals 1. So again, we're setting the counter to 1. I'm going to say do something, so some code block, while, and this time I'll say x is less than 1. And in here, I'm just going to log something to the console. Do while loop number, and we'll concatenate that with x. And let's not forget that we want to increment x as well. Now our value of x is already set to 1. If it's set to 1, it should not meet this condition. This do loop should not run. So when I save this, we shouldn't see anything. However, we see do while loop number 1. Uh-oh, what's going on here? Did I make a mistake? Let me ask Tim. Tim, my handy debugging duck. Is there something that I've done wrong here? I've set x to 1, and we've given this loop a condition saying while x is less than 1. So in theory, this should not run. So this is something we need to understand about do while loops, that they always run once. So what happens is our condition isn't even checked. So this code block automatically runs, and it displays this do while loop number and displays the x value of 1 here in the console, as you can see. And then after incrementing x to 2, it then checks to see, is this condition met? So this is really important. We must note that the loop runs once before it checks the condition. Okay, so x is already set to 1, yet the loop still runs. So you have to be a little careful when you're using the do while loop, and it can be a bit tricky. So we've had a good look at the 3 different loops in JavaScript: the for loop, the while loop, and the do while loop. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button so I can continue to make more amazing videos for you in the weeks to come. Until next week, keep on coding.